Welcome back. In today's video, we are taking a complete look at one of the most important cars Japan has ever built. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why it still commands the kind of respect that most modern supercars can only dream of. We are covering everything that matters here: the design, the interior, the engineering of its time, how it actually feels to drive, what it was like to own one, the flaws nobody likes to talk about, what it cost then versus what it is worth now, and how it stacked up against the biggest names in the sports car world at the time. So if you want the full picture before you form your own opinion, stay with me until the end, because there are a few details coming up that genuinely surprised me while researching this car. Picture Japan in the mid-1960s. The rest of the world still saw Japanese cars as small, practical, and forgettable. Nobody outside the country expected anything close to a world-class grand tourer to come out of Tokyo. And then, almost out of nowhere, a low, sleek, fastback coupe rolled onto a motor show stand and completely rewrote that assumption in a single afternoon. This is the story of a car that was never supposed to make money, was built in numbers you could count on two hands multiple times over, and yet ended up changing how the entire planet looked at Japanese engineering. This is the story of the Toyota 2000 GT. The background here is more interesting than most people realize. The design actually started life somewhere else entirely. Nissan had been working with a proposal from Yamaha for a genuine halo sports car, one built with real performance intent rather than just image. Nissan walked away from it, worried about the cost of building something so ambitious in such small numbers. Toyota, however, saw an opportunity. They picked up the project, brought in design input inspired by the same school of thinking that shaped some of the era's great European coupes, and pushed it into production, despite knowing full well it would likely never turn a profit. This was never meant to be a volume seller. It was meant to prove a point, and prove it did. Look at the exterior, and you can immediately see why it stopped people in their tracks in 1967. The nose is long and low, the roofline drops into a tight, flowing fastback, and the whole body sits impossibly close to the ground for a car of that decade. Pop-up headlights tuck away into the front fenders, the wheel arches flare just enough to hint at aggression without ever feeling forced, and the greenhouse tapers into one of the most elegant rear ends of the era. It genuinely looks like it was sculpted by someone who had spent years studying the great European grand tourers and then decided to do it their own way. It is no coincidence that when the producers of a certain British spy franchise needed a car worthy of appearing beside their leading man in Japan, they chose this one, cutting the roof off two examples just to accommodate an actor who was simply too tall to fit inside. And that brings us to a real limitation of this car, because stepping inside tells a very different story than the exterior promises. The cabin is snug, in the way that only a genuine 1960s sports car cabin can be. Toggle switches line a wood-trimmed dashboard. The gauges sit deep and purposeful in front of the driver, and everything about the layout says, this is a machine built for someone who wanted to drive, not lounge. But that low roofline and tight footwell mean taller drivers genuinely struggle to get comfortable. This was one of the most common criticisms at the time, and it remains one today. It is a beautifully finished space, rich with detail and craftsmanship, but it was clearly designed around a specific kind of driver, and if you did not fit that mold, you felt it immediately. Now, when we talk about technology here, we have to think about it in the context of its era, rather than comparing it to anything modern. This was a car that used a backbone chassis for genuine structural rigidity. Four-wheel disc brakes at a time when many rivals still relied on drums somewhere on the car, and fully independent suspension front and rear, tuned specifically to keep the car planted through fast corners. Under the hood sat a 2-liter dual overhead cam inline-six, fed by 3 Mikuni Solex carburetors, producing around 150 horsepower. That number alone does not sound dramatic today, but paired with a curb weight of only around 2,400 pounds and a near-perfect front-to-rear weight distribution, the car had a kind of balance that engineers were only just beginning to properly understand. On the road, that balance is really the whole story. This was never the fastest car in a straight line. 0 to 60 took roughly 10 seconds, and top speed sat around 128 miles per hour. Numbers that even contemporary reviewers pointed out were behind some of its direct rivals. But raw numbers were never really the point. What owners and journalists praised again and again was how the car felt on a winding road, how planted and predictable it remained through a fast sweeper, how the 5-speed manual gearbox, itself a rarity for the period, let the driver stay right in the meat of that inline-six's power band. One prominent American road test at the time called it one of the most exciting and enjoyable cars they had driven. And that sentiment still holds up when you talk to people lucky enough to have driven one today. From a safety standpoint, remember this was engineered in an age before crumple zones and airbags were even part of the conversation. What Toyota and Yamaha delivered instead was a genuinely stiff, well-braced chassis, disc brakes on all 4 corners for far more consistent stopping power than most rivals offered, and a suspension setup engineered to keep the car composed rather than nervous at speed. For its time, this was about as advanced and thoughtfully engineered as road car safety got. Ownership, though, is where the real story of this car takes an interesting turn. Production ran only from 1967 to 1970, and in that entire span, just a few hundred examples were ever built, somewhere in the low 300s, depending on how you count the prototypes. Of those, only a small fraction, well under 100, ever made it to American shores. That rarity alone makes ownership today an entirely different experience than owning almost any other classic sports car. Toyota, to their credit, still supports these cars decades later, reproducing hard-to-find parts through their Heritage Parts program, specifically so the surviving examples can stay on the road rather than becoming static museum pieces. Owning one today is less about daily practicality and much more about being the caretaker of a piece of automotive history. Let's talk honestly about strengths and weaknesses, because no legendary car is without both. The strengths are obvious. Styling that still turns heads more than half a century later, genuinely advanced engineering for its era, a driving experience built around balance and feel rather than brute force, and a rarity that makes every surviving example feel special. The weaknesses are just as real. That cramped cockpit limits who can comfortably drive it. The performance figures, even when new, trailed some of its direct competition in a straight line. And the eye-watering original price meant it was never going to sell in any real volume, which is exactly why Toyota expected to lose money on every single one they built. And that price is worth pausing on, because it tells you everything about how Toyota positioned this car. In the United States, it launched at just over $7,000, which does not sound like much today, but at the time that was more expensive than a Jaguar E-Type, more expensive than a Porsche 911, and comfortably more expensive than a Chevrolet Corvette. Toyota was not trying to undercut the establishment. They were trying to walk right up beside it and prove they belonged there. Fast forward to today, and that same car regularly sells at auction for anywhere between $600,000 and well over $1 million, depending on originality and history, making it one of the most valuable Japanese cars ever produced. Very few vehicles from any country have appreciated in value quite like this one. Which brings us naturally to how it stacked up against the competition of its day. The Jaguar E-Type was quicker in a straight line and slightly cheaper, and is still regarded by many as one of the most beautiful cars ever made. But it lacked the sheer engineering novelty of a small Japanese manufacturer building something this ambitious from scratch. The Porsche 911 offered a different kind of driving character entirely, rear-engined and more focused, but again priced below what Toyota was asking. And when the Datsun 240Z arrived just a couple of years later, it undercut the 2000 GT dramatically on price while offering strong performance of its own, effectively taking the torch and running with it into mass production success that the 2000 GT itself never achieved. So what was the actual impact of this car on the industry, and on Toyota specifically? It did not sell in big numbers, and it was never meant to. What it did instead was permanently change how the rest of the world viewed Japanese automotive engineering. It proved a Japanese manufacturer could design, engineer, and build a genuine world-class grand tourer, worthy of standing next to Europe's best, and worthy of sharing the screen with one of cinema's most famous characters. Every fast, ambitious Toyota that followed, every Supra, every Lexus LFA, in some way owes a debt to this car, proving it could be done in the first place. So that is the complete picture of the Toyota 2000 GT. A car that was never built to make money, never built to sell in huge numbers, and yet ended up being one of the most important vehicles to ever wear the Toyota badge. It is proof that sometimes the most influential cars in history are not the best-selling ones. They are the ones brave enough to prove a point. If this video gave you a genuine appreciation for why this car still matters, do me a favor and hit that like button. Subscribe if you have not already, and let me know down in the comments which classic you want us to break down next, because there are plenty more stories like this one still waiting to be told.